Hello, very beautiful community. It's lovely to be with you this Sunday afternoon. What we'll do today is revisit the Vance-Trump misbehavior, gross misbehavior in the Oval Office and Zelensky's handling of it. Not specifically to reanalyze it, but to reground us a bit for a period of a few weeks, a few months, in which it's going to be an acceleration of events, a lot of things happening that are confronting, challenging, difficult to accept and impact us, not just intellectually and emotionally, but also physiologically. So my task is to be sort of offering something like gentle confrontation today. Not confrontation as in conflict, but confrontation as in confronting the world in a way that sort of doesn't evade the complexity of it, but also trying to be gentle on ourselves. So let's do this. And another aspect of what we'll do today is that it's one of those sort of sessions we typically have once every few weeks, where we sort of re-legislate the dynamics of relations of trust between us. So let's do this. So what happened yesterday, beautiful community, is that several hundred people unsubscribed from the channels, and several hundred people subscribed as well. So it's a sort of a net loss of maybe 100 people altogether. But the unsubscribe rate is the biggest bump we've had since sort of September, October, when there was a big unsubscribe bump when I was saying that I thought Trump would win. There's a video on the main channel where I said that with Kamala having replaced Biden, we've moved from Trump being virtually certain to win to Trump being very likely to win. And a good number of real regulars unsubscribed. Actually, somebody wrote to me unsubscribing, having given me a few warnings that they're about to unsubscribe, and having actually been active on the channels for 3 years. So we've had a bump since then. So we're going to look at the comments now. And the comments were to do with my criticism of Zelensky's handling of himself in the Oval Office. But we won't dwell on what I said being false or true. We'll sort of use this as an opportunity to reground ourselves far beyond this trivial issue. So I said two things. I'm going to read them out because I actually read them out literally on the live yesterday. So we'll be starting from exactly the same spot. But don't think we're sort of, reheating old cabbage here. I promise we'll do this in a way that's sort of constructive and takes us beyond the nitty-gritty of this particular issue. I said two things. The first one was Vance escalated the situation in a premeditated way. And I didn't mean premeditated in the sense that there was a committee meeting before. I meant that in the sense that at least a few moments before, Vance looked around and decided, is this going to work optically to push and escalate this? And he said, yeah, it will. And then he did it. So that's why I call it premeditated. He wasn't out of control at all. Vance escalated the situation in a premeditated way for a MAGA audience and to impress Trump. He was completely in control when he did it. It was an act of accomplished bullying. By that I mean bullying from a position of strength, not bullying because you're like defensive and uncomfortable, but bullying because you're completely comfortable, but yet you want to go out and bully. An accomplished act of bullying. Zelensky was ambushed. And I know a lot of people have argued that Zelensky wasn't ambushed, but my analysis is that he was relative to the description I have just given, right? I'm not implying there was some kind of committee meeting to script this. But the challenge that some people had in the communities with the next thing I said, and that's what we'll process now. We'll look at your comments literally on the screen in a moment. Zelensky arrived looking flat. He wasn't ready to do what Macron and Starmer did. When he got ambushed, he was petulant, combative, and unprepared. Bill Clinton used to say that high-level politics is smiling and eating shit at the same time. Zelensky couldn't do it. Most people in the pro-Ukraine bubble will reject this point, but in doing so, they'll be delusional. But in 2025, it's time to get real. So let's look at your comments, and then we're going to broaden this in a way that's really constructive around just dealing with all the crap that's going on in the world. But I want to straight away say something that's really important. What happened in the Oval Office is shocking. And you can forget all the details. It's already enough that Trump and Vance, especially Vance, conducted themselves the way they did. It's already enough to sort of desacralize an important institution in US democracy, right? It's already irreversibly democratically toxic. It's just a small drop of toxicity, but it's an irreversible drop of toxicity to create such a calamity in the Oval Office. It degrades democratic ritual in a way that harms the capacity for, constructive engagement in conflict on which democracy depends. So there was already just something very shocking about that in itself. And many people actually, you might say that's a bunch of snowflakes, but I kind of don't buy that. Many people sort of, were awake at night as a result of the ugliness of this. We're thinking, this is such a shocking state, for our democracy to be in. So I want to acknowledge the sort of sickly impactfulness of it. So let's go. Comment from Martin Haggerty. Now, I don't want to say hello, Martin, because Martin is claiming he's gone, but unfortunately, a lot of people who announce they're unsubscribing are here 1 week later. So what I would say is if you're genuinely unsubscribing from a channel, but you want to be respectful toward it, actually it's super respectful to click the unsub button, because it actually hurts the channel to have lingering subs who don't watch. Zelensky was the only adult in the discussion. He was shouted down when he tried to answer. It's most unfair of you to criticize a man who has faced assassination attempts for the last 3 years. Cancelled you. Thank you so much for cancelling me, Martin. Lots of love. The second comment, used message. You're incorrect. They were going to bully him no matter what he said. They have coordinated with Russia. Well, I hope you don't mean they literally coordinated with Russia how to handle this. You may mean that they are engaged in the negotiation process with Russia, which is sort of incompatible with hearing from Zelensky terrible things about Putin. There are two ways, by the way, in which Trump was triggered by Zelensky criticizing Putin. One is that they've got a process going with the Russians and it disturbs it to talk about Putin as a killer. But the second is that Putin is such an important source of narcissistic supply for Trump that criticizing Putin is like dropping to the floor a part of Trump. And you could see that visceral reaction in him. Mary Maloney, yeah, absolutely. Vlad's incorrect. And Foxberg says, it's unbelievable to me that Vlad can't see it. Now, let's restabilize a tiny bit epistemically by pointing out that I have said that Vance was in control and he instigated an ambush. Let's read a nice comment now. Vlad, I love you, beautiful public intellectual. Love back. However, I'm beginning to wonder why you are belaboring Zelensky's shortcomings. Sorry, my printers printed this out in a very pale way. I know that he's still a new politician on the global stage, and more than half of this time he's been dealing with war issues. So I say to you, we've heard what's wrong with how he performed, and most of us have observed that, but once is enough to do a constructive critique. Love from Oz, love back, and missing Oz very much. Don't worry, I will be saying a little bit more by way of reply to this. Anthony Stringfellow, your take on this event is not up to your usual standards. What I'm referring to is that you seem to suggest that Zelensky's behavior contributed to the breakdown. I do think that's correct. That's the correct description of my claim. That's not at all what I saw. What I saw was that the whole thing was orchestrated. That's not necessarily incompatible with the point that Zelensky contributed to the breakdown. I hope both your health and your judgment improve. Anthony Stringfellow 5'1", 5'2". I hope my health improves desperately, and I hope my judgment improves. However, I do find that my judgment keeps improving. 5, comment number 5. Just have to disagree with Vlad again on how Zelensky behaved. If he sat there meekly, obsequiously allowing Trump to build a rhetorical structure that is both post-truth and against the interests of Ukraine, then that would have been bad. And then there's a comment from me which says that's both a false picture of what I said and a false picture of what Zelensky did. I didn't say he needed to be meek, but prepared and proactive in executing whatever approach he chose. Zelensky wasn't proactive in challenging Vance and Trump. And once Vance started his foul ambush, Zelensky was petulant, frustrated, reactive, and passive. So that's quite a blunt comment from me. And I tend to have a policy of being 10% into answering comments casually, just which can be sometimes quite brutal, and 90% answering them in a way that would be constructive also for other people looking. And I don't think it falls into that 10%, but it is pretty much to the blunt side of the 90%. It's still useful for everybody to see it, but it's quite bluntly put. So there we go. And I'll be in a moment making a point about what else I think we need to consider when we think about the perception of Zelensky's performance by people who aren't us, by people who don't like Ukraine, because that's quite important. And of course, what I'm really saying, and I was relaboring this yesterday in the live, isn't that he needed to be one thing or another, but that he needed to be one thing properly. He could have challenged Trump less or more, but it needed to be done in a proactive way with ownership. More. Chris Scott. I disagree with your assessment of Zelensky's reaction. He had every right to push back against the ambush, which I think he did. Pantaleimon Vlad, I'm sorry, but I think you're wrong. Zelensky pushing back was not responsible, it was necessary. And Liam Long, for once I disagree with Vlad. His overly harsh criticism of Zelensky, it's a national disgrace for the president and the vice president. Well, I agree, it's a national disgrace. Thor, Vlad, when you predict the comments will disagree with you, you're patronizing us. And then there is a response from me, which I think I'm okay with. Public intellectual works means you speak not the truth, but the truth that you feel it's important for people to hear. So let's try to do a bit of work on this. It's very unimportant that you accept my view about this. But let me just state it very briefly and state my level of sort of confidence in it for convergence from you or for differentiation. And by the way, let me say that normally 99.5% of viewers who click like or dislike a live that I do, yesterday's rating is 97%. So also notice that disjunction, right, between what the comments suggest and what the less involved audience thinks, right? So that pushback in the comments is more representative of some of the active community, but less representative of the less active community. So what does it take to judge what Zelensky did there? How he reacted to this? What I think is absolutely shocking behavior from Vance in particular and Trump. I think you need emotional intelligence and imaginative self-extraction, second. And above all, you need to understand how it will look to others who aren't you, who won't see that what Vance did is bad. You see? Because one of the problems is that Zelensky looked meek and passive. Because I am claiming, so I'm going to restate my position here, I am claiming that this was absolutely foul behavior and a kind of ambush from Vance and Trump that's really sort of offensive to elementary sensibility, because think of who you're speaking to. You're speaking to a guy who is flat out trying to keep his country together, whatever criticisms that you might have of him, and to bully him for the benefit of a domestic audience is very, very unlovely, right? It's a reflection of the degradation of our politics. And I do think that it's okay to say that it's not just unlovely, but it's unlovely in a very confronting way, right? But then I'm saying that Zelensky got lost in what was happening rather than reacting proactively. And you can be proactively meek in a disciplined way or proactively challenge. Macron challenged Trump. Keir Starmer challenged Trump twice. So I'm kind of agnostic about how that balance is struck. What I'm not agnostic about is whether this was something that was happening to Zelensky and he was caught out and reacting, or whether he was being proactive in response to it. So that's my claim. And on the spot, there were lots of things I'm saying that would have been done much better by him if they'd planned a little bit, right? Showing Trump pictures, for example, was really, really a poor move. A real illustration of not having thought through Trump's needs and possibilities. Now, this is pretty high demand, because what's happened is that with Trump's ADHD, the boredom of looking at the pictures triggered Trump and began to make him angry, actually. The narcissism kicking in there as well. So there are lots of things that just weren't thought through, which is the opposite of the UK visit, where it was clear that a group of people sat through and went through exactly how to balance it. And Zelensky should have converted to Ukrainian when things got tough. He shouldn't have had himself speak at the same time as these guys, even if he wanted to. There's quite a lot to say. And of course, Macron and Starmer have my view, not the view of the comments about what happened, right? They're utterly repulsed by the behavior of Trump and Vance, but they don't think Zelensky handled it as well as he could have done. But I mean, God, it's hard. Like God, it's hard. And it's almost understandable if one has sort of a block about criticizing Zelensky about it, because for goodness sake, he, earns so much empathy for what he's having to hold. So, next point. And so just quickly, don't have that imposed on you, right? React to what I'm saying by sharing it or differentiating yourself from it. What level of confidence do I have about what I'm saying? It's high, right? I'm pretty clear that that's my recommendation about how to judge it. So Starmer and Macron are interesting, because if you look at the Starmer visit, I was very worried that it would go wrong. I was very worried that Starmer was going to sit there in a kind of mild technocratic way, just create two boxes in his head, what's reasonable and what's not reasonable, and then begin challenging Trump by saying things like, yes, Mr. President, that's right, but actually I think on balance we think this and we think that. And they didn't. They said, let's absolutely let Trump ride roughshod over reality 98% of the time. But on the key issues where it's absolutely right to challenge, we're going to come in and challenge, and we're going to challenge in a gentle but very clear way. So when Vance said, hey guys, you've got a free speech issue in England, Starmer said, and you could see that this whole balance was planned out by committee before. Starmer said, thank you so much. Look, we're extremely proud of our free speech traditions in the UK because they're both age old and actually here to stay. You see how nicely that was done? And it was nicely done because he had a here is what I prepared earlier kind of plate onto which to put that response that he had to generate on the spot, but with the infrastructure for how to balance it already developed in advance. And it's because they did that it went well. Without that, Starmer's meeting was set up to be a disaster, because Starmer was just going to sit there and make sort of reasonable points, which were going to be very mildly put. He wasn't going to get into back and forth with Trump, but they were going to be, they were going to challenge Trump too regularly. Now, here is the really key point I want to emphasize, beautiful community, for us epistemically. And I'm going to create two camps here. One is okay and one is not. So imagine Vlad has said something on his channels and you're there. Two camps. I disagree. You shouldn't have said this. I disagree. You shouldn't have said this, right? And what we want to say is, I disagree, green tick. That's a perfect response. You shouldn't have said this is not a good response. It's a scary response, right? It's like that. It's scary. It's like any argument is good insofar as it's aimed at the other side. I don't want to see what's not, appealing to my vantage point. It's scary. It's that kind of psychology of deciding who you share the table of politics with via wishful thinking, not the recognition of who's actually around you and with whom you have to negotiate, right? So it's sort of you shouldn't have said this is the perfect way to get yourself in a pathology as a citizen where you're not able to engage in conflict effectively, right? That's really important. Now, it isn't true in my case because it would require me feeling uncomfortable about saying what I said about Zelensky, and I wasn't uncomfortable. I knew that some of you were not going to like it. I wasn't uncomfortable. But if I were a bit uncomfortable, what I'd say would actually be infinitesimally courageous, right? Because I know that it serves me to not mention it, right? But I'm out there saying it, as I've always done, and most of the people you watch do not do that, right? And that's really important. It's more important than the substance, right? Imagine somebody's telling you something that you don't share, but you recognize, right, that they're saying it knowing that you may not like it, and it doesn't serve them from the point of view of, I don't know, whatever you might say, building their channel. Another point, the lack, and this is going to sound quite brutal, the lack of criticism of Zelensky and Ukraine from the academic expert community in public has been shameful, because it's often been at zero. Like the absence of mild criticism of Ukraine from the academic community is quite disturbing, quite frankly, right? Really, really disturbing, and a feature of 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, because 20 years ago it wouldn't have happened. We could have said we're right behind Ukraine, but we can also make any observation we think is significant, even if not all of them are happen to be positive. So that the fact that it's sort of 100-0 in the public work of many academics is a disgrace, I'm afraid to say, a real disgrace, a kind of a real failure of professional respect for the counter-majoritarian institution which the academy is, which is necessary to keep your democracy on the road, on which, funnily enough, Ukraine depends too, right? The worst thing for Ukraine is for European and Western democracies to decline, and the best thing is for them to be strong. Look at what's happening to Ukraine right now. Why is Ukraine in a difficult position this week? It's because US democracy is in decline, right? So then there's also a risk of us asking our content creators to be our Trumps. That's to say, to put into us only things that sort of already work well with our motivational set, rather than putting things into us which they think we should consider, right? So when I'm telling you something that you don't agree with, I am treating you with respect. When I'm telling you that, Russia is going to collapse next Tuesday or whatever, or that Trump's going to lose power next Wednesday, I'm not treating you with respect, right? So there's a very big risk, because all the algorithmic incentives are designed for the audience to ask their content creators to not treat them with respect, to throw stuff into them that's going to be the most effective bait, rather than put things that are sometimes going to be, disagreeable or challenging. When we think of our society being sick, this is the last point, I invite us to not think of it being sick in terms of us and them. We are cool here, but they are, let's say Trump voters are there, the sick ones over there. I invite us to think of it in terms of various kinds of complicated forces acting on all of us, to which we then respond more or less constructively. So it's not we are cool here and they are sick over there, but it's always there's certain pathologies in our society that are making our society sick, and we're all vulnerable to them in different ways, right? And the difference between us and Trump voters is how we resolve these pools, how we answer these vulnerabilities, in some ways better than them, in other ways worse than them, right? Because it's probably true, but it's not obviously true that we in this community are less delusional than Trump voters. I think we are less delusional, but I think we are also prone to many of the unlovely pathologies swimming about in our culture. And this idea that we do us and them when we talk about what's wrong with our society is unconstructive, because it simply prevents exploration of how we are victims of sort of complicated stuff swimming around, right? That often corrupts the thought and sentiment, even of intelligent people with integrity, right? And there's a sort of a concept I'll be speaking about more, perhaps in the next main channel video on Trump's narcissism, and that's the pattern of psychotic thought. And psychotic thought is something that happens to all of us a tiny bit, but it happens a lot to, some people, but a bit to everyone. And psychotic thought is just when things about the world are so difficult to bear that you destroy the world in your mind. And, there's a big sort of monster down the corner of the street there, and you say, no, there's nothing there. So that's very, very important. It's just the destruction of the world in your head, which isn't just something that's rife in Trumposphere, which is very rife there with magical thinking beyond cause and effect about politics, but it's rife everywhere. And it's certainly tempting to apply psychotic thought to Ukraine and Zelensky by just not liking any criticism about it. Like, under what condition? If you're in a position where under no condition would you like criticism of Zelensky, then something has gone really, really wrong there, right? It's very important to watch for that in ourselves. So we always want to reach and explore, and not us and them, this dynamic, by saying that all the pathologies are on the other side with the people who've elected these destructive muppets who misbehaved in the Oval Office. But the pathologies in our society affect us all. I'm going to be here. I'm hearing you, and lots of love. Final request: confrontational gentleness is what I tried for. Give me a score out of 10 and how I did. My score normally for my work with us here is, abstracting away my illness, a 4 out of 10, and with my illness a 6 out of 10. But it's always improving. So, the 4 is going to be a 4.5, and the 6 is going to be a 6.5 in a matter of months. So I'm just so blessed by this capacity to have the privilege of being able to do what I'm doing better and better. But that's my general score for myself. What's your score for me on this particular talk, where I try to balance a few things? Lots of love. Talk very soon about more concrete politics.